just wanted to talk to you about Mari and her presence in this region, in Beecroft and Cheltenham. Now, her family arrived in Australia and in Beecroft quite early, in 1911. Her father, Cyril, came out here to take up a job as chief signals engineer with the railways. And a very important influence on Mari came from both her parents, but I think especially from her mother, Ida. Now, the Byleses must have stood out in Beecroft at that time. If you think of what you know about the suburb at the beginning of that century, it's still a new suburb, and the people who established it were looking to the model of a sort of English village. They didn't appreciate the bushland particularly. One of the prominent citizens, Charles Churchill Tucker, wanted to cut down the bush and establish an English sort of park with a cricket pitch. They established a suburb which, of course, revolved around the School of Arts that they built, and especially, I think, the churches. Now, the Byles family were vegetarians, they were Fabian socialists, they were Unitarians, and they had a love of the English countryside, which they transferred to here. And the house that they built, which I'm sure some of you are familiar with, Chilworth, at the end of what is now Wellham Street, overlooks the bushland that it was part of the land that they donated to us, to the people of this area. And so Mari would have been an unusual girl too. She briefly went to Beecroft Public School, then she went to PLC, Croydon, and she finished her schooling at PLC, which was a fairly new school in Pymble, where she was both the dux and the head prefect. So she was the leader from the beginning. And she told her mother, with her mother's encouragement, that she didn't intend to marry. She was going to have an independent life and a career. She did an arts degree, and she followed up by doing law. Now, she wasn't the first women graduate in law from Sydney University, but she was one of the first, and in her year, when they finished, she was the only woman. And if you were a woman in this very conservative profession, you couldn't get a job as a lawyer. They would employ you as a law clerk. That was as far as it went. So Mari worked a few years as a law clerk, and then she began her career travelling, mountaineering, and so on. But when she came back, she graduated in 1924. When she came back from her first excursions abroad in 1928-29, she decided she would set up in practice as a solicitor, the first woman in New South Wales to do so. And that practice initially was in Eastwood, where she went on to found a firm where all the staff were women. And they shared the profits. The women were all paid much the same, whatever job they did. So she was in a sense a very early feminist, as well as an early lover of the bush, bushwalker and all the rest of it, which you can get from the film and also from the storyboards that are placed around here. Now, it was in 1937 that she purchased the land that we are standing on today. And in accordance with her philosophy gained from her study of Buddhism and from Gandhi, she decided to build a very simple house, virtually one room, standing lightly on the land here, of very simple materials, fibro, oil timber, tiled roof, as you can see. And this was built where we are now, this structure, the Hut of Happy Omen, because this was where she invited her friends to visit, to talk, to have discussions on the bunks that were behind to stay overnight. And this is where she meditated, or she sat out on one of the rocks and meditated. So her presence, I think, is very much around us just here. And what you've done today, walking through the bushland and finishing up at the Hut of Happy Omen for refreshments is what Marie initiated. In 1963, when the Beecroft Cheltenham Civic Trust was formed, she was one of the people who attended the very first meeting and was elected vice president. Now, the Civic Trust has always had a joint interest in the preservation of the village character, but also in the preservation of the bushland. And I think it was to her and to John Noble that we owe particularly the continued interest in the bushland and its preservation. So Marie lived here, and again, I think in Beecroft she always stood out as an unusual person. One former Beecroft identity whom I interviewed remembered Marie when she was a young girl. She said, "I remember her walking up to the station wearing her loose pants with a backpack and her walking boots and her hat on, and she got on the train to go down to Eastwood to her practice, and my mother said to me, 'There goes that peculiar Marie Byles.'" So I think as she was always a very strong individual. Now, I don't want to go on too much longer about this. She kept up her practice until, very unfortunately, she was attacked in her home, and she eventually had to retire from her practice. This was in the 1960s, and she continued to live here. In the later stages of her life, about 1975, she built Sentosa for a carer or somebody to help her keeping up her lifestyle in her home at AHIMSA, and she died in 1979. So it's a life which, although she spread herself across the world, she's known to lots of people. She's had an influence on the women lawyers, she's had an influence on the Buddhists, she's had an influence on the whole bushwalking and love of the bushland. She also has had a considerable significance just to us who still live in Beecroft. Okay, thank you.